So let's look at how we would use a load handling equipment hazard when doing your NEBOSH NG2 or IG2 practical project. There are some critical mistakes that you want to avoid because this hazard category can very easily be confused for other things. And if you want to pass your NEBOSH assessment, you want to make sure that you categorize hazards correctly. So we'll look at what load handling equipment applies to in terms of the category, what it does not apply to, and then we'll look at some of the laws that you could use to perhaps justify the actions that you wish to take. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the hazard categories. And so the correct hazard category there, the correct way of phrasing it is load handling equipment. And so we would type that into our risk assessment form right here, load handling equipment. And so the first thing is, if you think back to your course materials and what hazards you discussed in the load handling equipment section, you'll have noticed a bit of a crossover with, for example, manual handling. Barrows and trolleys and things which you push, things which you pull, like a pallet truck, that is a manual handling hazard. You know, the pulling and the pushing and of those things, that's a manual handling hazard, but those things are also load handling equipment. So how do you not confuse the two? Here's the thing. If you're going to be addressing the manual handling risk, i.e. the back injuries, the cuts to the hands, the injuries to the feet when you run it over your feet, that's a manual handling hazard category. But if you're going to talk about the stability of the equipment, so for example, the loading of it and you overload it and it overturns, or if you talk about things falling off of it, you know, you go over a bump and then things fall off, lands on someone, that's a load handling equipment hazard. So this load handling equipment category is really reserved for issues of stability, overloading, things overturning, dropping things onto people. Great. So make sure you differentiate between load handling equipment and manual handling. The other area of confusion is that sometimes people get confused between load handling equipment and vehicle hazards, because a lot of load handling equipment is a vehicle, like a forklift truck is a vehicle and it's also load handling equipment. And I often see people crash and burn with this because they're talking about a forklift and they're talking about the forklift movement, they're putting things up on the racking, and it's like you've got a vehicle hazard in there, there's a falling object hazard, there's a load handling hazard. It's like, that's just a big mess. If you're going to talk about, say, a forklift in the load handling equipment category, you need to focus on the forklift being overloaded, the load being secure, strapped, that it's not going to fall off, things are not going to overturn. Okay, so that's what we focus on in this load handling equipment hazard category. If you're watching this and you're a NEBOSH student, did you know that you have a ton of resources on the Compassa website which you can use? Many of them are very, very cheap. You've got our YouTube section here, loads of free advice here, but if you want some study books, if you want exam technique documents, exam technique guides, instructions on how to do your NG2 or IG2 practical project, you can download those at some very, very reasonable prices from our website. And if you wanted hands-on tutor support with full access to all of our tutorials, guides, me and my colleagues at the tips of your fingers, consider signing up for our NEBOSH Rescue package. You'll get access to our full course and tutor support at a heavily discounted rate. And, well, frankly, you'll struggle to find pass rates that are as consistently high anywhere else. Let's get back to the advice. So what could we say? We could say something like use of an overhead crane to lift large containers up to 15 ton in weight over the production hall. Okay, so now we know what it is. We know what the equipment is. We know what it's doing. We know how big and heavy it is. And we have a little bit of context. It's being lifted over the production hall. I can picture that. Let's rephrase to something else. We could say something like the use of forklifts to load and unload trucks and store goods on warehouse racking, carrying pallets up to 1,000 kilos. Okay, there we are. Now we have a pretty good description of that hazard. Now in your who might be harmed and how, again, you have to be careful that you don't start to talk about colliding with things, because that's the different category. Let's look at our hazard categories. The hazard categories here, movement of people and vehicles in the workplace. If you want to talk about collision, It goes in that category, not any other category. So we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about the things we discussed in load handling, which is losing loads, failure of lifting mechanisms, and the overturning of the forklift. So here we could talk about the FLTs could drop their loads, as these are sometimes poorly secured by the suppliers. Forklifts could also overturn due to presence of potholes in the yard. Either event could lead to a fatality due to crushing. There we are. I think that's a pretty specific who might be harmed and how. It's a very difficult hazard, this, because load handling equipment is such a broad category of equipment. It even includes things like conveyors. So we need to just remember that it will focus on the strength, the capability of the equipment to lift the load. We focus on whether the load is secure, and we focus on things falling or overturning. Now, when looking at our control measures, we have to make sure we bring the organization into legal compliance. So we have to look at the law, the approved codes of practice, whatever duties apply. Then we're going to use that law later if we have an action on this. So if we use a load handling equipment action on the sheet, we're going to use that law in these specific legal arguments. Now, what law you use depends on the type of equipment. So for national students, for NEBOSH NGC students, the classic legislation for this category is going to be LOLA, the Lifting Operations and Lifting Equipment Regulations of 1998. Now, this only applies if the equipment is actually lifting equipment, if it's got some kind of lifting mechanism. Not all load handling equipment has a lifting mechanism. A barrow or trolley or even a pallet truck isn't really covered by this. So have a look through what's legally required. You probably want to talk about the strength of the equipment, the safe working load, the way it's positioned, the way it's marked, how the operation is organized in terms of the management and the supervision of it. Definitely want to talk about thorough examinations and the frequency of when it's examined. Is it 6 months or 12 months? And you'll be talking about the training as well, because there will be other requirements, because here's where it gets complicated. Lifting equipment is also covered by PUA, Provision and Use of Work Equipment Regulations. And so you've got two laws which apply to this, and this also requires things like maintenance and inspections and training and just broadly the suitability and the stop controls and stability and markings, safe working loads and warnings, like a big siren which goes off when the equipment starts. So you've got two laws which might apply, and you need to get all of the legal requirements into these different columns. Now, sometimes your equipment is not covered by LOLA. For example, a sack truck or a barrow or a pallet truck. You could broadly just use PUA for this and just broadly talk about the suitability of it. You know, if it's something which can very easily overturn, you could talk about the suitability for the task it is being used for. Now, interestingly, in PUA, you've got some really specific stuff which is relevant to this topic. Now, if you remember, we studied the overturning of forklifts, and we've actually got all this here, mobile work equipment. We've got some duties there. In particular, you've got some stuff about the overturning of forklifts. You've got the rolling over of mobile work equipment. So it might be worth having a look at that to see if this duty is relevant to you. International students doing the NEBOSH IGC, what have you got? Well, I would say one of your best documents is the ILO Code of Practice, Safety and Health in the Use of Machinery, which is a very broad code of practice. And let's look at the table of contents. There isn't a lot on this. It talks a lot about guarding. But if we scroll right down, you will see page 82, lifting machinery such as cranes and hoists. So let's do a little search for 82. There we are, page 82. It talks about the suitability for the lifting operation, talks about non-routine stuff, access to dangerous areas. There's a lot of stuff in here. So again, use this for your risk assessment if that's relevant to you. If it's relevant to the hazard, then you could use it to recommend actions or to identify existing actions. And you could also use it in the specific legal arguments there if you have an action that is relevant to those things. So as usual, hope you found that super useful. Quite a tricky one to use, but hopefully I've given you enough advice there so that you don't accidentally confuse it with manual handling and vehicles, because they are all different things. See you in the next one.